Good evening. I didn't hear you coming up the front step. My apologies for not answering sooner. Please, won't you come in? I'd hate for you to catch cold, especially with the storm looking like it's about to break at any moment. This way, inside, please, thank you. There's plenty of room for all in the foyer here. Now, let's just close out the storm and see about getting you settled. Shall we? Now, coats and hats over here, please. Thank you. And I'll just leave them here. Now, I do wish to give you a small warning. You may want to wipe your feet there on the rug before we proceed any further. The old wood panels here are slippery. There we go. And now, if you will, please follow me. We will go to the elevator that I have here in the house. We'll take that up to the 3rd floor, and from there we will adjourn to the library. I'd recommend all that you please remain together, especially those of you who are new. We'd rather not lose anybody on your first outing here. Isn't that correct? It's now just down the hall here. And for those who are interested, the lift itself was installed approximately 50 years ago. Still runs fairly strong, I assure you. Now, if you would all please kindly step inside here. Thank you. Please make room for everyone. And away we go. I understand that my reclusiveness has given me something of a reputation, but I can assure you I am no different from you or anyone else here in this lovely town of ours. My home, however, is a bit of a different story, but we'll leave that for a different time. Now, where were we? Here we are. Now, give me just a moment. The house itself is not wired for electricity, which means that everything has to be done by matchlight. Where did I put that? Here they are. And there we are. Now, if you will follow me down to the library. There is tea and biscuits waiting for us, and you're more than welcome to partake of both. Here we are. Now, please make yourselves at home, and if you need to, again, as I said, the tea is over here, and I will be happy to pour some for you. Sit anywhere you like. Apart from that chair, please, thank you. I'm rather particular about my own seat. Now then, let's get comfortable, and as we enjoy our tea and each other's company, let me see, what shall we read tonight? No, I don't think so, not that one. How about... yes, a fine selection that we have here. I think these will do just nicely. Several ghost stories and one poem. Let's hope that you find them all adequate. Before the evening's done, I hope to lull you perhaps into a sense of somnambulance. But until then, let's begin. Our first story this evening is by a man who needs no introduction. Of course, Mr. H.P. Lovecraft is best known for his horrific tales of eldritch beings, secrets best not known by mankind, and the various alien forces that we as humans are but a mere speck of dust in comparison to. There were occasions, however, where he instead wrote things of a more chilling nature, something a bit less expansive and a touch more intimate. This particular story is known as The Terrible Old Man. I rather enjoy it, and I hope you will as well. It recounts the story of three gentlemen who have taken it upon themselves to relieve an elderly gentleman of his wealth one evening in April. What they find is that perhaps there is a little more to this old man than shaking knees and wandering eyes. The Terrible Old Man by H.P. Lovecraft. It was the design of Angelo Ricci and Joe Cesnac and Manuel Silva to call upon the terrible old man. This old man dwells all alone in a very ancient house on Water Street near the sea, and is reputed to be both exceedingly rich and exceedingly feeble, which forms a situation very attractive to men of the profession of Messrs. Ricci, Cesnac, and Silva, for that profession was nothing less dignified than robbery. The inhabitants of Kingsport say and think many things about the terrible old man, which generally keep him safe from the attention of gentlemen like Mr. Ricci and his colleagues, despite the almost certain fact that he hides a fortune of indefinite magnitude somewhere about his musty and venerable abode. He is, in truth, a very strange person, believed to have been a captain of East India clipper ships in his day, so old that no one can remember when he was young, and so taciturn that few know his real name. Among the gnarled trees in the front yard of his aged and neglected place, he maintains a strange collection of large stones, oddly grouped and painted so that they resemble the idols of some obscure Eastern temple. This collection frightens away most of the small boys who love to taunt the terrible old man about his long white beard and long white hair, or that try to break the small-paned windows of his dwelling with wicked missiles. But there are other things which frighten the older and more curious folk, who sometimes steal up to the house to peer in through the dusty panes. These folks say that on a table in a bare room on the ground floor are many peculiar bottles, in each a small piece of lead suspended pendulum-wise from a string, and they say that the terrible old man talks to these bottles, addressing them by such names as Jack, Scarface, Long Tom, Spanish Joe, Peters, and Mate Ellis, and that whenever he speaks to a little bottle, the piece of lead pendulum within makes certain definite vibrations, as if in answer. Those who have watched the tall, lean, terrible old man in these peculiar conversations do not watch him again. But Angelo Ricci and Joe Cesnac and Manuel Silva were not of Kingsport blood. They were of that new and heterogeneous stock which lies outside the charmed circle of New England life and traditions, and they saw in the terrible old man merely a tottering, almost helpless graybeard, who could not walk without the aid of his knotted cane, and whose thin, weak hands shook pitifully. They were really quite sorry in their way for the lonely, unpopular old fellow who everybody shunned, and at whom all the dogs barked singularly. But business is business, and to a robber whose soul is in his profession, there is a lure and a challenge about a very old and very feeble man who has no account at the bank, and who pays for his few necessities at the village store with Spanish gold and silver minted 2 centuries ago. Messrs. Ricci, Cesnac, and Silva selected the night of April 11th for their call. Mr. Ricci and Mr. Silva were to interview the poor old gentleman, while Mr. Cesnac waited for them and their presumable metallic burden with a covered motor car in Ship Street, by the gate in the tall rear wall of their host's grounds. Desire to avoid needless explanations in case of unexpected police intrusions prompted these plans for a quiet and unostentatious departure. As prearranged, the 3 adventurers started out separately in order to prevent any evil-minded suspicion afterwards. Messieurs Ricci and Silva met in Water Street by the old man's front gate, and although they did not like the way the moon shone down upon the painted stones through the budding branches of the gnarled trees, they had more important things to think about than mere idle superstition. They feared it might be unpleasant work making the terrible old man loquacious concerning his hoarded gold and silver, for aged sea captains are notably stubborn and perverse. Still, he was a very old and feeble man, and there were two visitors. Messieurs Ricci and Silva were experienced in the art of making unwilling persons voluble, and the screams of a weak and exceptionally venerable man can be easily muffled. So they moved up to the one lighted window and heard the terrible man talking childishly to his bottles with pendulums. Then they donned masks and knocked politely at the weather-stained oaken door. Waiting seemed very long to Mr. Cesnac as he fidgeted restlessly in the motor car by the terrible old man's back gate in Ship Street. He was more than ordinarily tender-hearted, and he did not like the hideous screams he had heard in the ancient house just after the hour appointed for the deed. Had he not told his colleagues to be as gentle as possible with the pathetic old sea captain? Very nervously he watched that narrow oaken gate in the high and ivy-clad stone wall. Frequently he consulted his watch and wondered at the delay. Had the old man died before revealing his treasure, or had a thorough search become necessary as a result? Mr. Cesnac did not like to wait so long in the dark in such a place. Then he sensed a soft tread or tapping on the walk inside the gate, heard a gentle fumble at the rusty latch, and saw the narrow, heavy door swing inward. And in the pallid glow of the single, dim street lamp, he strained his eyes to see what his colleagues had brought out of that sinister house which loomed so close behind. But when he looked, he did not see what he had expected, for his colleagues were not there at all, but only the terrible old man, leaning quietly on his knotted cane and smiling hideously. Mr. Cesnac had never noticed before that the color of the man's eyes were yellow. Little things make considerable excitement in little towns, which is the reason that Kingsport people talked all that spring and summer about the three unidentified bodies, horribly slashed as with many cutlasses, and horribly mangled as by the tread of many cruel boot heels which the tide had washed in. And some people even spoke of things as trivial as the deserted motor car found in Ship Street, or certain especially inhuman cries, probably of a stray animal or a migratory bird, heard in the night by wakeful citizens. But in this idle village gossip the terrible old man took no interest at all. He was by nature reserved, and when one is aged and feeble, one's reserve is doubly strong. Besides, so ancient a sea captain must have witnessed scores of things much more stirring in the far-off days of his unremembered youth. Now then, I hope that whetted your appetite for what is to come. That, and the tea, and of course the biscuits. Oh, there's no reason to shiver. I assure you, this is about as eerie as it will get, I promise. You have no reason to doubt my word, after all. Some of you are returning, and some of you have assurances from others who have come to visit me before. But the night is short, and I don't want to keep you here until daybreak, so let us continue. The next story is The Malice of Inanimate Objects by a personal favorite author of mine, Mr. Montague Rhodes James. m.r.james, of course, is known as a master of ghost stories, having influenced many a writer, including H.P. Lovecraft himself. Mr. James has a unique perspective when it comes to ghosts, rather than present to us rattling figures in chains or the sort that moulder around houses. His ghosts often are vengeful and more often than not, rather violent. His stories also seem to include, on the whole, a antiquarian who stumbles into some kind of trouble and wishes that he hadn't. For this particular story, though, I'm going to be introducing you to Mr. James's work through one of the more comedic tales that he's told, and I hope that perhaps you will enjoy it. I present to you The Malice of Inanimate Objects by m.r.james. The malice of inanimate objects is a subject upon which an old friend of mine was fond of dilating, and not without justification. In the lives of us all, short or long, there have been days, dreadful days, on which we have had to acknowledge with gloomy resignation that our world has turned against us. I do not mean the human world of our relations and friends. To enlarge on that is the province of nearly every modern novelist. In their books it is called life, and an odd enough hash it is as they portray it. No, it is the world of things that do not speak or work or hold congress and conferences. It includes such things as the collar stud, the inkstand, the fire, the razor, and, as age increases, the extra step on the staircase, which leads you either to expect or not to expect it. By these, and such as these, for I have named but the merest fraction of them, the word is passed round and the day of misery arranged. Is the tale still remembered of how the cock and hen went to pay a visit to Squire Corby's? How on the journey they met with and picked up a number of associates, encouraging each other with the announcement, "To Squire Corby's we are going, for a visit is owing." Thus they secured the company of the needle, the egg, the duck, the cat, possibly, for memory is a little treacherous here, and finally the millstone. And when it was discovered that Squire Corby's was out for the moment, they took up positions in his mansion and awaited his return. He did return, wearied no doubt by a day's work among his extensive properties. His nerves were first jarred by the raucous cry of the cock. He threw himself into his armchair and was lacerated by the needle. He went to the sink for a refreshing wash and was splashed all over by the duck. Attempting to dry himself with the towel, he broke the egg upon his face. He suffered other indignities from the hen and her accomplices, which I cannot now recall, and finally, maddened with pain and fear, rushed out by the back door and had his brains dashed out by the millstone that had perched itself in the appropriate place. Truly, in the concluding words of the story, Squire Corby's must have been either a very wicked or a very unfortunate man. It is the latter alternative which I am inclined to accept. There is nothing in the preliminary to show that any slur rested on his name, or that his visitors had any injury to avenge. And will this narrative not strike as a prime example of that malice of which I have taken upon to treat? It is, I know, the fact that Squire Corby's visitors were not all of them, strictly speaking, inanimate. But are we so sure that the perpetrators of this malice are really inanimate either? There are tales which seem to justify a doubt. For example, 2 men of mature years were seated in a pleasant garden after breakfast. One was reading the day's paper, the other sat with folded arms, plunged in thought, and on his face were a piece of sticking plaster and lines of care. To interrupt here, by sticking plaster means something of a band-aid in the Victorian period. His companion lowered the paper. "What," he said, "is the matter with you? The morning is bright, the birds are singing, I can hear no aeroplanes or motorbikes." "No," replied Mr. Burton. "It is nice enough, I agree, but I have had a bad day before me. I cut myself shaving, and I spilt my tooth powder." "Ah," said Mr. Manners, "some people have all the luck." And with this expression of sympathy, he reverted to his paper. "Hello," he exclaimed after a moment. "Here's George Wilkins dead. You won't have to bother about him, anyhow." "George Wilkins?" said Mr. Burton, more than a little excitedly. "Why, I didn't even know he was ill." "No more he was, poor chap. Seems to have thrown up the sponge and put an end to himself. Yes," he went on, "it's some day back. This is the inquest. Seemed very much worried and depressed, they say. What about, I wonder? Could it have been that will you and he were having a row about? A row? Said Mr. Burton angrily. There was no row. He hadn't a leg to stand on. He couldn't bring a scrap of evidence. No, it may have been a half-dozen things, but Lord, I never imagined he'd take it as hard as that. I don't know, said Mr. Manners. He was a man, I thought, who did take things hard. They rankled. Well, I'm sorry, though I never saw much of him. He must have gone right through a lot to make him cut his own throat. Not the way I would choose, by a long sight. Luckily, he hadn't a family, anyhow. Look here, what about a walk around before lunch? I have an errand in the village. Mr. Burton assented rather heavily. He was perhaps reluctant to give the inanimate objects of the district a chance at getting at him. If so, he was right. He just escaped a nasty pearl over the scraper at the top of the steps. A thorny branch swept off his hat and scratched his fingers, and as they climbed a grassy slope, he fairly leapt into the air with a cry and came down flat on his face. What in the world? Said his friend, coming up. It's a great string of all things. What business? Oh, I see. It belongs to that kite, which lay on the grass a little further up. Now, if I can find the little beast who left that kicking about, I'll let him have it. Or rather, I won't, for he shan't see his kite again. It's a rather good one, too. As they approached, a puff of wind raised the kite, and it seemed to sit up on its end and look at them with two large, round eyes painted red, and, below them, 3 large printed red letters, I see you. Mr. Manners was amused, and scanned the device with care. Ingenious, he said. It's a bit of a poster, of course, I see. Fool particulars the word was. Mr. Burton, on the other hand, was not amused, but thrust his stick through the kite. Mr. Manners was inclined to regret this. I dare say it serves him right, he said, but he'd taken a lot of trouble to make it. Who had? Said Mr. Burton sharply. Oh, I see. You mean the boy. Yes, to be sure. Who else? Well, come on down now. I want to leave a message before lunch. As they turned the corner into the main street, a rather muffled and choky voice was heard to say, Look out! I'm coming! They both stopped, as if they had been shot. Who was that? Said Manners. Blessed if I didn't think I knew. Then, with almost a yell of laughter, he pointed with his stick. A cage with a grey parrot in it was hanging in an open window across the way. I was startled, by George. It gave you a bit of a turn, too, didn't it? Burton was inaudible. Well, I shan't be a minute. You can go and make friends with the bird. But when he rejoined Burton, that unfortunate was not, it seemed, in trim for talking with either birds or men. He was some way ahead, and going rather quickly. Manners paused for an instant at the parrot window, and then hurried on, laughing more than ever. Have a good talk with Polly, he said as he came up. No, of course not, said Burton testily. I didn't bother about the beastly thing. Well, you wouldn't have got much out of her if you'd tried, said Manners. I remembered after a bit. They've had her in the window for years. She's stuffed. Burton seemed about to make a remark, but suppressed it. Decidedly, this was not Burton's day out. He choked at lunch, he broke a pipe, he tripped in the carpet, he dropped his book in the pond in the garden. Later on, he had, or professed to have, a telephone call summoning him back to town next day, and cutting short what should have been a week's visit. And so glum was he all the evening that Manners' disappointment in losing an ordinarily cheerful companion was not very sharp. At breakfast, Mr. Burton said little about his night, but he did intimate that he thought of looking in on his doctor. My hand is so shaky, he said. I really daren't shave this morning. Oh, I am sorry, said Mr. Manners. My man could have managed that for you, but they'll put you right in no time. farewells were said. By some means, or for some reason, Mr. Burton contrived to reserve a compartment to himself. The train was not of the corridor type, but these precautions avail little against the angry dead. I will not put dots or stars, for I dislike them, but I will say that apparently someone tried to shave Mr. Burton in the train, and did not succeed overly well. He was, however, satisfied with what he had done, if we may judge from the fact that on a once white napkin spread on Mr. Burton's chest was an inscription in red letters, G.O.W. Fiki. Do not these facts, if facts they are, bear out my suggestion that there is something not inanimate behind the malice of inanimate objects? Do they not further suggest that when this malice begins to show itself, we should be very particular to examine, and, if possible, rectify any obliquities in our recent conduct? And do they not, finally, almost force upon us the conclusion that, like Squire Corby's, Mr. Burton must have been either a very wicked or a singularly unfortunate man? I think that we can all agree that there's a lesson to be learned here, that lesson being that if you decide to take the life of a fellow, that you perhaps make sure that you are not around any sharp implements for the next, I don't know, several years, perhaps. It seems to take and give when these spirits decide to attack and when they can no longer do so, but I'm philosophizing. In the meantime, would anybody here appreciate another cup of tea? You, sir? Very good. Have a moment. There we are. I believe I myself could use some too. Reading aloud seems to become thirsty work after a while. But in the meantime, let us go ahead and begin on our next story, shall we? This next one comes to us from H. Munro. However, Mr. Munro is best known for his pen name, adequate and interestingly called Saki, S-A-K-I. Mr. Munro, or Saki, of course, was something of a humorist and wrote many different types of stories. Among them, several noteworthy and interesting ghost stories or stories of the supernatural. I rather enjoy his work and intend to share more of them as we go along, but for tonight I have chosen one of his more interesting and devious tales. I would suggest that Mr. Munro was somebody who, perhaps, had a lack of fondness when it came to children, or at least saw them as being as capable of doing harm as a grown adult, for a number of his stories involve just such tykes running around, causing misery for those around them with their cleverness. This story is no different. Sredni Vashtar is the title, and involves a young boy who takes his love of a pet to reverential levels. One might even call it deifying it. All in the face of his overbearing cousin, who is convinced that at some point he will not survive beyond the year of 15 years old. Now then, let us begin. Sredni Vashtar by H. Munro. Saki. Conradin was 10 years old, and the doctor had pronounced his professional opinion that the boy would not live another 5 years. The doctor was silky and effete, and counted for little, but his opinion was endorsed by Mrs. de Ropp, who counted for nearly everything. Mrs. de Ropp was Conradin's cousin and guardian, and in his eyes she represented those 3/5 of the world that are necessary and disagreeable and real. The other 2/5, in perpetual antagonism to the foregoing, were summed up in himself and his imagination. One of these days Conradin supposed he would succumb to the mastering pressure of wearisome, necessary things such as illness and coddling restrictions and drawn-out dullness. Without his imagination, which was rampant under the spirit of loneliness, he would have succumbed long ago. Mrs. de Ropp would never, in her honestest moments, have confessed to herself that she disliked Conradin, though she might have been dimly aware that thwarting him for his own good was a duty which she did not find particularly irksome. Conradin hated her with a desperate sincerity, which he was perfectly able to mask. Such a few pleasures as he could contrive for himself gained an added relish from the likelihood that they would be displeasing to his guardian, and from the realm of his imagination she was locked out, an unclean thing which should find no entrance. In the dull and cheerless garden, overlooked by so many windows that were ready to open with a message to not do this or that, or a reminder that medicines were due, he found little attraction. The few fruit trees that it contained were set jealously apart from his plucking, as though they were rare specimens of their kind blooming in an arid waste. It would probably have been difficult to find a market gardener who could have offered 10 shillings for all of their yearly produce. In a forgotten corner, however, almost hidden behind a dismal shrubbery, was a disused tool-shed of respectable proportions, and within its walls Conradin found a haven, something that took on the varying aspects of a playroom and a cathedral. He had peopled it with a legion of familiar phantoms, evoked partially from fragments of history and partly from his own brain, but it also boasted 2 inmates of flesh and blood. In one corner lived a ragged, plumaged Howden hen, on which the boy lavished an affection that had scarcely another outlet. Further back in the gloom stood a large hutch, divided into 2 compartments, one of which was fronted with close iron bars. This was the abode of a large polecat ferret, which a friendly butcher boy had once smuggled, cage and all, into its present quarters, in exchange for a long-secreted hoard of small silver. Conradin was dreadfully afraid of the lithe, sharp-fanged beast, but it was his most treasured possession. Its very presence in the tool-shed was a secret and fearful joy, to be kept scrupulously from the knowledge of the woman, as he had privately dubbed his cousin. And one day, out of heaven knows what material, he spun the beast a wonderful name, and from that moment it grew into a god and a religion. The woman indulged in religion once a week at a church nearby, and took Conradin with her, but to him the church service was an alien rite in the house of Rimmon. Every Thursday, in the dim and musty silence of the tool-shed, he worshipped with mystic and elaborate ceremonial before the wooden hutch where dwelt Sredni Vashtar, the great ferret. Red flowers in their season and scarlet berries in the winter-time were offered at his shrine, for he was a god who laid some special stress on the fierce, impatient side of things, as opposed to the woman's religion, which, as far as Conradin could observe, went to great length in the contrary direction. And on great festivals, powdered nutmeg was strewn in front of his hutch, an important feature of the offering being that the nutmeg had to be stolen. These festivals were of irregular occurrence, and were chiefly appointed to celebrate some passing event. On one occasion, when Mrs. de Ropp suffered from an acute toothache for 3 days, Conradin kept up the festival during the entirety of those 3 days, and almost succeeded in persuading himself that Sredni Vashtar was personally responsible for the toothache. If the malady had lasted another day, the supply of nutmeg would have given out. The Howden hen was never drawn into the cult of Sredni Vashtar. Conradin had long ago settled that she was an Anabaptist. He did not pretend to have the remotest knowledge as to what an Anabaptist was, but he privately hoped that it was dashing and not very respectable. Mrs. de Ropp was the ground plan on which he based and detested all respectability. After a while, Conradin's absorption in the tool-shed began to attract the notice of his guardian. "It's not good for him to be pottering around down there in all weathers," she promptly decided, and at breakfast one morning she announced that the Houghton hen had been sold and taken away overnight. With her short-sighted eyes, she peered at Conradin, waiting for an outbreak of rage and sorrow, which she was ready to rebuke with a flow of excellent precepts and reasoning. But Conradin said nothing. There was nothing to be said. Something perhaps in his white-set face gave her a momentary qualm, for at tea that afternoon there was toast on the table, a delicacy which she usually banned on the ground that it was bad for him, also because the making of it gave trouble, a deadly offence in the middle-class feminine's eye. "I thought you liked toast," she exclaimed with an injured air, observing that he did not touch it. "Sometimes," said Conradin. In the shed that evening there was an innovation in the worship of the hutch god. Conradin had been wont to chant his praises. Tonight he asked a boon. "Do one thing for me, Sredni Vashtar." The thing was not specified. As Sredni Vashtar was a god, he was supposed to know, and choking back a sob as he looked at the other empty corner, Conradin went back to the world he so hated. And every night, in the welcome darkness of his bedroom, and every evening, in the dusk of the tool-shed, Conradin's bitter litany went up. "Do one thing for me, Sredni Vashtar." Mrs. de Ropp noticed that the visits to the shed did not cease, and one day she made a further journey of inspection. "What's you keeping in that locked hutch?" she asked. "I believe it's guinea pigs. I'll have them all cleared away." Conradin shut his lips tight, but the woman ransacked his bedroom till she found the carefully hidden key, and forthwith marched down to the shed to complete her discovery. It was a cold afternoon, and Conradin had been bedridden and kept to the house. From the furthest window of the dining room, the door of the shed could be seen, just beyond the corner of the shrubbery, and there Conradin stationed himself. He saw the woman enter, and then he imagined her opening the door of the sacred hutch and peering down with her short-sighted eyes into the thick straw bed where his god lay hidden. Perhaps she would prod at the straw with her clumsy impatience, and Conradin fervently breathed his prayer for the last time. But he knew as he prayed that he did not believe. He knew that the woman would come out presently with that pursed smile he loathed so well on her face, and that in an hour or two the gardener would carry away his wonderful god, a god no longer, but a simple brown ferret in a hutch. And he knew that the woman would triumph always, as she triumphed now, and that he would grow ever more sickly under her pestering and domineering and superior wisdom, till one day nothing would matter much more with him, and the doctor would be proved right. And in the sting and misery of his defeat, he began to chant loudly and defiantly the hymn of his threatened god. Sredni Vashtar went forth, his thoughts were red, and his teeth were white. His enemies called for peace, but he brought them death. Sredni Vashtar the beautiful. And then of a sudden he stopped his chanting, and grew closer to the window pane. The door of the shed still stood ajar as it had been left, and the minutes were slipping by. They were long minutes, but they slipped by nevertheless. He watched the starlings running and flying in little parties across the lawn. He counted them over and over again, with one eye always on that swinging door. A sour-faced maid came in to lay the table for tea. And still Conradin stood and waited and watched. Hope had crept by inches into his heart, and now a look of triumph began to blaze in his eyes that had only known the wistful patience of defeat. Under his breath, with a furtive exultation, he began once again the paean of victory and devastation. And presently his eyes were rewarded. Out through that doorway came a long, low, yellow and brown beast, with eyes a-blink at the waning daylight, and dark wet stains around the fur of jaws and throat. Conradin stopped and dropped to his knees. The great polecat ferret made its way down to a small brook at the foot of the garden, drank for a moment, then crossed a little plank bridge and was lost to sight in the bushes. Such was the passing of Sredni Vashtar.
"Tea is ready," said the sour-faced maid. "Where is the mistress?"
"She went down to the shed some time ago," said Conradin, and while the maid went to summon her mistress to tea, Conradin fished a toasting fork out of the sideboard drawer and proceeded to toast himself a piece of bread. And during the toasting of it, and the buttering of it with much butter, and the slow enjoyment of eating it, Conradin listened to the noises and silences which fell in quick spasms beyond the dining-room door, the foolish, loud screaming of the maid, the answering chorus of wondering ejaculations from the kitchen region, the scuttering footsteps, and hurried embassies for outside help, and then, after a lull, the scared sobbing and the shuffling tread of those who bore a heavy wooden burden into the house.
"Whoever will break it to the poor child? I couldn't for the life of me,"
exclaimed a shrill voice. And while they debated the matter among themselves, Conradin made himself another piece of toast. So passes Sredni Vashtar. I always find a little bit of amusement in that one. Between the own life that I led growing up, with a similar figure in my life, there's a bit of catharsis that goes with it, and I'm sure that we can all appreciate that. We're going to take a small break now, just to allow me to get a bit of a stronger drink before we continue. But before we have our momentary lapse and allow you to interact with one another, I will read one last piece here. The Listeners, a poem by Walter de la Mare. I've heard it compared to Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, in point of fact as being one of the more famous pieces that every child in England is forced to learn, just like in America here, where people are forced to more or less know The Raven at some point in their education. Both are excellent poems, but I do find The Listeners to be perhaps a bit more interesting, not the least of which it is a great deal shorter than the poem by Edgar. And so I present to you The Listeners by Walter de la Mare. "Is anybody there?" said the traveller, knocking on the moonlit door, and his horse in the silence champed the grasses of the forest's ferny floor, and a bird flew up out of the turret above the traveller's head, and he smote upon the door again a second time. "Is anybody there?" he said. But no one descended to the traveller. No head from the leaf-fringed sill leaned over and looked into his grey eyes, where he stood perplexed and still, but only a host of phantom listeners that dwelt in the lone house then stood listening in the quiet of the moonlight to that voice from the world of men, stood thronging the faint moonbeams on the dark stair that goes down to the empty hall, hearkening in the evening air. By the lonely traveller's call, and he felt in his heart their strangeness, their stillness answering his cry, while his horse moved and cropped the dark turf neath the starred and leafy sky. For he suddenly smote on the door even louder and lifted his head. "Tell them I came, and no one answered, that I kept my word," he said. Never the least stir made the listeners, though every word he spake fell echoing through the shadowiness of the still house from the one man left awake. Aye, they heard his foot upon the stirrup, and the sound of iron on stone, and how the silence surged softly backward when the plunging hoofs were gone. There now. As I said, I will take a small reprieve, get myself something a bit stronger to drink before we move on to our next tale. And please, feel free to enjoy the refreshments a bit longer and the atmosphere and ambience but I won't leave you completely alone in silence. Perhaps a little music will help. One moment. Let's see. Here we are. Yes, I rather like this one. And here we are, returned once more. Now, where were we? Ah, yes. Now I remember. The next story is another one of Mr. M.R.James's works. This one does, in fact, have a ghost in it. Far more tangible than the usual one, at least the one that was in the last tale from Mr. James. Rats is its title. The story was first published in Random Magazine, March 23rd, 1929. It was later included in an anthology, The Collected Ghost Stories of M.R.James. Rats is set near the Suffolk coast in England, where a man takes accommodation at an inn, only to find out that a very unpleasant secret hides behind the locked door of a room along the passage of his own. For those of you who may be concerned or perhaps have a fear of rats, you need not be worried. There's not a single rat to be seen in this entire story. There's something far worse. Rats by M.R.James. And if you was to walk through the bedrooms now, you'd see the ragged, mouldy bedclothes a-heaving and a-heaving like seas. And a-heaving and a-heaving with what? He says. Why, with the rats under 'em. Excerpt from Tom Tiddler's Ground by Florence Marryat. But was it with the rats? I ask because in another case it was not. I cannot put a date to the story, but I was young when I heard it, and the teller was old. It is an ill-proportioned tale, but that is my fault, not his. It happened in Suffolk, near the coast, in a place where the road makes a sudden dip and then a sudden rise. As you go northward, at the top of that rise stands a house on the left of the road. It is a tall red brick house, narrow for its height. Perhaps it was built about 1770. The top of the front has a low triangular pediment with a round window in the center. Behind it are stables and offices and such garden as it has behind them. Scraggy Scotch firs are near it. An expanse of gorse-covered land stretches away from it. It commands a view of the distant sea from the upper windows of the front, and a sign on the post stands before the door. Or it did so, for though it was once an inn of repute, I believe it is no longer. To this inn came my acquaintance, Mr. Thompson, when he was a young man, on a fine spring day, coming from the University of Cambridge, and desirous of solitude, in tolerable quarters, and time for reading. These he found, and for the landlord and his wife, who had been in service, and could make a visitor comfortable, and there was no one else staying in the inn. He had a large room on the first floor, commanding the road and the view, and if it faced east, why, that could not be helped. The house was well built and warm. He spent very tranquil and uneventful days. Work all the morning, an afternoon perambulation of the country road, a little conversation with country company, or the people of the inn in the evening, over the then fashionable drink of brandy and water, a little more reading and writing, and bed. And he would have been content that this should continue for the full month he had at disposal. So well was his work progressing, and so fine was the April of that year, which I have reason to believe was that which Orlando Whistlecroft chronicles in his weather record as the charming year. One of his walks took him along the northern road, which stands high and traverses a wide common, called a heath. On the bright afternoon, when he first chose this direction, his eye caught a white object some hundreds of yards to the left of the road, and he felt it necessary to make sure what this might be. It was not long before he was standing by it, and found himself looking at a square block of white stone, fashioned somewhat like the base of a pillar, with a square hole in the upper surface. Just such another you may see at this day at Thetford Heath. After taking stock of it, he contemplated for a few minutes the view, which offered a church tower or two, some red roofs of cottages, and windows winking in the sun, and the expanse of sea, also with an occasional wink and gleam upon it, and so pursued his way. In the desultory evening talk in the bar, he asked why the white stone was there on the common. "An old-fashioned thing, that is," said the landlord, Mr. Betts. "We was none of us alive when that was put there." "That's right," said another. "It stands pretty high," said Mr. Thompson. I dare say a sea marker was on it at some time back." "Yes," said Mr. Betts, agreeing with him. "I have heard that they could see it from the boats, but whatever there was, it fell to bits this long time." "Good job, too," said a third. "'Twarn't a lucky mark, by what the old men used to say. Not lucky for the fishing, I mean to say." "Why ever not?" said Thompson. "Well, I never seen it myself," was the answer, "but they had funny ideas, peculiar, them old chaps, and I shouldn't wonder what they made away with it themselves." It was impossible to get anything clearer than this. The company, never very voluble, fell silent, and when next someone spoke, it was of village affairs and crops. Mr. Betts was the speaker. Not every day did Thompson consult his health by taking a country walk. One very fine afternoon found him busily writing at 3 o'clock. Then he stretched himself and rose and walked out of his room into the passage. Facing him was another room, then the stairhead, then two more rooms, one looking out to the back, and the other to the south. At the south end of the passage was a window, to which he went, considering with himself that it was rather a shame to waste such a fine afternoon. However, work was paramount just at the moment. He thought he would just take 5 minutes off and go back to it, and Those 5 minutes he would employ the Bettses, well, they could not possibly object, to his looking at the other rooms in the passage, which he had never seen. Nobody at all, it seemed, was indoors, probably as it was a market day. They were all gone to town, except maybe the maid in the bar. Very still the house was, and the sun shone really hot. Early flies buzzed in the window panes. So he explored. The room facing his own was undistinguished, except for an old print of Bury St. Edmunds. The two next to him, on his side of the passage, were bright and clean, with one window apiece, whereas his had two. Remained the southwest room, opposite to the last which he had entered. This was locked, but Thompson was in a mood of quite indefensible curiosity, and feeling confident that there could be no damaging secrets in a place so easily got at, he proceeded to fetch the key of his own room, and, when that did not answer, to collect the keys of the other three. One of them fitted, and he opened the door. The room had 2 windows looking south and west, so it was as bright and the sun as hot upon it as it could be. Here there were no carpets, but bare boards. No pictures, no washing stand, only a bed in the farther corner, an iron bed, with mattress and bolster, covered with a bluish check counterpane. As featureless as the room you can well imagine it to be, there was something that made Thomas close the door very quickly, and yet quietly, behind him, and lean against the window-sill in the passage, actually quivering all over. It was this, that under the counterpane lay someone, not only lay, but stirred. That it was someone, and not something, was quite certain, because the shape of a head was unmistakable on the bolster, and yet it was all covered, and no one lies with covered head but a dead person. And this was not dead, not truly dead, for it heaved and shivered. If he had seen these things in dusk or by the light of a flickering candle, Thompson could have comforted himself and talked of fancy. On this bright day, though, that was impossible. What was to be done? First, lock the door at all costs. Very gingerly he approached it, and, bending down, listened, holding his breath. Perhaps there might be a sound of heavy breathing and a prosaic explanation. There was absolute silence. But as, with a rather tremulous hand, he put the key into its hole and turned it, it rattled, and on the instant a stumbling, padding tread was heard coming towards the door. Thompson fled like a rabbit to his room and locked himself in. Futile enough, he knew it was. Would doors and locks be any obstacle to what he suspected? But it was all he could think of at that moment, and in fact, nothing happened. Only there was a time of acute suspense, followed by a misery of doubt as to what to do. The impulse, of course, was to slip away as soon as possible from a house which contained such an inmate. But only the day before, he had said he would be staying for at least a week more, and how, if he changed plans, could he avoid the suspicion of having pried into places where he certainly had no business? Moreover, either the Bettses knew all about their inmate, and yet did not leave the house, or knew nothing, which equally meant that there was nothing to be afraid of, or knew just enough to make them shut up the room, but not enough to weigh on their spirits. In any of these cases, it seemed that not much was to be feared, and certainly, so far as he had had no sort of ugly experience. On the whole, the line of least resistance was to stay. Well, he stayed out his week. Nothing took him past that door, and often as he would pause in a quiet hour of day or night in the passage and listen, no sound whatever issued from that direction. He might have thought that Thompson would have had some attempt at ferreting out stories connected with the inn, hardly perhaps from the Bettses, but from the parson of the parish or old people in the village, but no, the reticence which commonly falls on people who have had strange experiences and believe in them was upon him. Nevertheless, as the end of his stay drew near, His yearning after some kind of explanation grew more and more acute. On his solitary walks, he persisted in planning out some way, at least obtrusive, of getting another daylight glimpse into that room, and eventually arrived at this scheme. He would leave by an afternoon train about 4 o'clock. When his fly was waiting, and his luggage on it, he would make one last expedition upstairs to look around his own room and see if anything was left unpacked, and then, with that key, which he had contrived to oil, as if that would make any difference, the door should once more be opened for a moment and shut. So it worked out. The bill was paid, the consequent small talk gone through while the fly was loaded. Pleasant part of the country, been very comfortable, thank you to you and Mrs. Betts. Hope to come back sometime. On one side, and on the other, very glad to have found you found satisfaction, sir. Done our best. Always glad to have your good word. Very much favoured. We've been with the weather this year, to be sure. Then I'll just take a look upstairs in case I've left a book or something out. No, don't trouble. I'll be back in a minute. And as noiselessly as possible, he stole to the door and opened it. The shattering of the illusion. He almost laughed aloud. Propped, or you might say sitting, on the edge of the bed was nothing in the round world but a scarecrow. A scarecrow out of the garden, of course, dumped into the deserted room. Yes, but here amusement ceased. Have scarecrows bare, bony feet? Do their heads loll on their shoulders? Have they iron collars and links of chain about their necks? Can they get up and move, if never so stiffly, across a floor with wagging head and arms close to their sides, and shiver? The slam of the door, the dash to the stairhead, and the leap downstairs were followed by a faint. Awakening, Thomas saw Mr. Betts standing over him with a brandy bottle and a very reproachful face. "You shouldn't have done so, sir. Really, you shouldn't. It ain't a kind way to act by persons as done the best they could for you." Thompson heard words of this kind, but what he said in reply he did not know. Mr. Betts, and perhaps even more Mrs. Betts, found it hard to accept his apologies and his assurance that he would say no word that could damage the good name of the house. However, they were accepted. Since the train could not now be caught, it was arranged that Thompson would be driven to the town to sleep there. Before he went, the Bettses told him what little they knew. They say he was a landlord ere a long time back, and was in with the highwaymen that had their beat about the heath. That's how he come by his end. Hung in chains, they say, up where you see that stone what the gallows stood in. Yes, the fishermen made away with that, I believe, because they see it out at sea, and it kept the fish off, according to their idea. Yes, we had the account from the people that had the house before we come. You keep that room shut up, they says, but don't move the bed out, and you'll find there won't be no trouble. And no more there has been. Not once he haven't come out into the house, though what he may do now there ain't no saying. Anyway, you're the first I know on that's seen him since we've been here. I never set eyes on him myself, nor don't want. And ever since we've made the servants' rooms in the stabling, and we ain't had difficulty that way. Only I do hope, sir, you'll always keep a close tongue, considering how an house do get talked about. With more to this effect. The promise of silence was kept for many years. The occasion of my hearing the story was, at last, this: that when Mr. Thompson came to stay with my father, it fell to me to show him to his room, and, instead of letting me open the door for him, he stepped forward and threw it open himself, and then for some moments stood in the doorway, holding up his candle and looking narrowly into the interior. Then he seemed to recollect himself and said, "I beg your pardon. Very absurd, but I can't help doing that for a particular reason." What that reason was, I heard some days afterwards, and you have heard now. There's often ghost stories associated with hotels and the like, and I find that this one's rather amusing. It's not the last time Mr. James would write of a haunted hotel, although that one was a hotel proper, rather than just a landlord's inn. We now come to the last story for the evening. This one by a gentleman known as Mr. Ambrose Bierce. Mr. Ambrose Bierce reminds me somewhat of Mr. Mark Twain, if Mr. Mark Twain wrote more about the Civil War and ghosts, although those two things were usually very separate from one another. Some of you may know his work, or at least one of his stories, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. That one has been adapted into several different types of films, but the story that I'm going to read tonight to close out our evening is different. It's a haunted house story in which there are a number of ghosts living, but taken from the perspective of a man sent and assigned, rather, to write a story for the local paper about this haunted house. You'll find it to be rather strange, and if you can tell me what happened in the end of it, you may in fact be a wiser and more discerning reader than I. For the time being, though, let us begin. A Fruitless Assignment by Ambrose Bierce. Henry Saylor, who was killed in Covington in a quarrel with Antonio Finch, was a reporter for the Cincinnati Commercial. In the year 1859, a vacant dwelling in Vine Street in Cincinnati became the center of a local excitement because of the strange sights and sounds said to be observed in it nightly. According to the testimony of many reputable residents of the vicinity, these were inconsistent with any other hypothesis other than the house was haunted. Figures with something singularly unfamiliar about them were seen by crowds on the sidewalk to pass in and out. No one could say just where they appeared upon the open lawn on their way to the front door by which they entered, nor at exactly what point they vanished as they came out. Or rather, while each spectator was positive enough about these matters, no two agreed. They were all similarly at variance in their descriptions of the figures themselves. Some of the bolder of the curious throng ventured on several evenings to stand upon the doorstep to intercept them, or, failing this, to get a nearer look at them. These courageous men, it was said, were unable to force the door by their united strength, and always were hurled from the steps by some invisible agency, and severely injured, the door immediately afterward opening, apparently of its own volition, to admit or free some ghostly guest. The dwelling was known as the Roscoe House, a family of that name having lived there for some years, and then, one by one, disappeared, the last to leave being an old woman. The stories of foul play and successive murders had always been rife, but never were authenticated. One day, during the prevalence of the excitement, Saylor presented himself at the office of the Commercial for orders. He received a note from the city editor, which read as follows: "Go and pass the night alone in the haunted house in Vine Street, and if anything occurs worthwhile, make 2 columns." Saylor obeyed his superior. He could not afford to lose his position on the paper. Apprising the police of his intention, he effected an entrance through a rear window before dark, walked through the deserted rooms, bare of furniture, dusty and desolate, and seated himself at last in the parlor on an old sofa which he had dragged in from another room, to watch the deepening of the gloom as night came on. Before it was altogether dark, the curious crowd had collected in the street, silent as a rule and expectant, with here and there a scoffer uttering his incredulity and courage with scornful remarks or ribald cries. None knew of the anxious watcher inside. He feared to make a light. The uncurtained windows would have betrayed his presence, subjecting him to insult, possibly even injury. Moreover, he was too conscientious to do anything to enfeeble his impressions, and unwilling to alter any of the customary conditions under which manifestations were said to occur. It was now dark outside, but light from the street faintly illuminated the part of the room he was in. He had set open every door in the whole interior, above and below, but all the outer ones were locked and bolted. Sudden exclamations from the crowd caused him to spring to the window and look out. He saw the figure of a man moving rapidly across the lawn toward the building, saw it ascend the steps, then a projection of the wall concealed it. There was a noise, as of the opening and closing of the hall door. He heard quick, heavy footsteps along the passage, heard them ascend the stairs, heard them on the uncarpeted floor of the chamber immediately overhead. Sailor promptly drew his pistol, and groping his way to the stairs, entered the chamber, dimly lighted from the street. No one was there. He heard footsteps in an adjoining room, and entered that. It was dark and silent. He struck his foot against some object on the floor, knelt by it, pressed his hand over it. It was a human head, that of a woman. Lifting it by the hair, this iron-nerved man returned to the half-lighted room below, carried it near the window, and attentively examined it. While so engaged, he was half conscious of the rapid opening and closing of the outer door, of footfalls sounding all around him. He raised his eyes from the ghastly object of his attention, and saw himself the center of a crowd of men and women dimly seen. The room was thronged with them. He thought the people had broken in. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said coolly, "you see me under suspicious circumstances," but his voice was drowned in peals of laughter, such laughter as is heard in asylums for the insane. The persons about him pointed at the object in his hand, and their merriment increased as he dropped it, and it went rolling among their feet. They danced about with it, with gestures grotesque and attitudes obscene and indescribable. They struck it with their feet, urging it about the room from wall to wall, pushed and overthrew one another in their struggles to kick it, cursed and screamed and sang snatches of ribald songs as the battered head bounded about the room as if in terror and trying to escape. At last it shot out of the door into the hall, followed by all with tumultuous haste. That moment the door closed with a sharp concussion. Sailor was alone in dead silence. Carefully putting away his pistol, which all the time he had held in his hand, he went to a window and looked out. The street was deserted and silent. The lamps were extinguished. The roofs and chimneys of the houses were sharply outlined against the dawn light in the east. He left the house, the door yielding easily to his hand, and walked to the commercial office. The city editor was still in his office, asleep. Sailor waked him and said, "I have been to the haunted house." The editor stared blankly, as if not wholly awake. "Good God!" he cried. "Are you Sailor?" "Yes. Why not?" The editor made no answer, but continued staring. "I passed the night there, it seems." They say things were uncommonly quiet out there," the editor said, trifling with a paperweight, which he had dropped his eyes upon. "Did anything occur?" "Nothing whatever." And so concludes our stories for the evening. I do thank you all for joining me, and now if you will follow me, I will escort you out to the front of the house again. This way, please. I do so enjoy being able to do this with guests, and I would love to have you all come by again. Of course, all of this has been recorded on phonographic records, and I will be having those copied and shared for all of you. You can expect to see them in the mail at some point. In the meantime, please mind yourself as we go back down in the lift. Please make room. Thank you. And as I was saying, I would be happy to make copies for everyone who is interested. It sounds like the storm hasn't quite broken up, but I'm sure that you'll all be able to make your way home again without too much trouble. Here we are, and everybody out. Your coats and hats are here. Please make sure to gather everything before you leave. And with that, I bid all of you a lovely good evening.